The president has now developed a bit of a bit in his rallies that harkens back to his racist tweets, and it riffs off of his racist belief that black people live in filth and squalor. So he does this bit now where he just repeatedly heaps the kind of racist scorn on his own constituents, our fellow Americans that live in major American cities, that he once reportedly heaped on major African countries, proving the president is both a racist who is being true to himself when he does this, and also thinks it is politically advantageous to do it. Joining me now to talk about all this is writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose hometown of Baltimore has recently been the subject of the president's attacks. Ta-Nehisi, you sent me a text this morning saying, or last night saying, are you doing something on Baltimore? I want to talk about it. What did you want to say?
Wow, you're just going to put me on blast like that.
Well, no, it's good.
Okay,
I mean, right. I wanted to hear.
Yeah, you know what I wanted to say? I wanted to say that I love Baltimore. And I wanted specifically young people in Baltimore and young black people in Baltimore who are always on the receiving end of a kind of invective about their lack of humanity, their lack of beauty, their lack of intelligence from the country at large, and now coming from the President of the United States. I thought it was very, very important that I speak out and let them know that I see them, that they're human, and that no matter what the crime rates are in Baltimore, I don't care if Elijah Cummings represented the district with the highest murder rate in America, with the highest murder rate in the world. It is never okay to refer to people as less than human, as vermin. No statistic can justify that.
I think we have this situation now where the president is clearly, he's been doing this forever. He's done it with Chicago. In fact, we went and did a town hall in Chicago in response to the way he talked about Chicago. We did reporting on Baltimore, partly because of exactly the way the national press covers that city, where he really wants this kind of racialized us versus them against our fellow Americans to be the kind of focal point of what he is, the story he's telling the country.
Well, but there's a direct connect to how he started, right? I mean, this is, the cousin of birtherism. Birtherism has its origins in the deep-seated belief that black people are not actually Americans. And that's a very, very old trope in this, the racist history. I mean, one of the great things that America has always struggled with was accepting black people. What it still struggles with is accepting black people as equal citizens. That goes back to 1619, continues today in 2019. The president doesn't consider Baltimore part of America. He doesn't consider Chicago part of America. He doesn't consider Puerto Rico part of America fundamentally. And he's not in much the same way that he did not consider Barack Obama an American. And those things are actually tied together. And he's pulling from a deep well in this country. Trump didn't invent that idea.
It's precisely because of the depth of the well he's pulling from that the stakes to me seem almost like existential, not in the sense of the country goes away if he wins again, but just in terms of like the fundamental question.
What is damage done?
Yeah, and what the question being called, as it has been in other times in this country's history, it was, it was definitely, I think, called during Reconstruction. It was called during Jim Crow. I mean, the question is called before the nation. What are we? What kind of country will we be? Who owns what America is? And it doesn't get any more fundamental than that to me, it seems.
Yeah, and it gets really scary because it's not just Trump. I really hate to call people out, but I thought it was a powerful example of this this week where the deputy Washington editor of the New York Times put out a tweet where within, asserting other things, and he would say he was trying to make a more complicated point, but what he basically wrote was that John Lewis was not from the Deep South. John Lewis, who was a sharecropper born in Alabama, who represents Atlanta. Atlanta was somehow not the Deep South. There was really no other way to read that except race, except excising black people out of the population of what it means to be, a citizen. And so, certainly, I would not argue that, the deputy editor is somehow a Trumpist, but you see how that rhetoric creeps into other, quote unquote, more respectable places. It's a very, very dangerous idea and very, very dangerous notions, precisely because they run so deep in America.
I wanted to ask you about this recording that was just unearthed, because it relates to something that you've written about a lot, that you and I have discussed a lot. In fact, we were talking about at the top of the show, right? The idea of sort of dog whistle, the idea of sort of politics that are racially coded, if not always explicitly barked in the way the president barks them. This really disgusting moment between, there's no other way to say it, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, which we covered last night. I want to play this little clip for you and get your reaction. Take a listen.
And last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television, as I did, yeah, to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
Well, and then the tail wags the dog there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The tail wags the dog.
It's all right there.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound cynical, but I don't know why we would be surprised by this. I mean, Ronald Reagan was, a white man who was raised in the 20th century in the era of Jim Crow, segregation, not necessarily in the Deep South, but definitely in the era of Jim Crow in America. We have a popular culture that reifies, especially during that time. This is an era that's replete with, blackface. It's replete with mocking representations of black people. There was a report, earlier this week that Reagan would often make the joke that when Africans had you for dinner, they quote unquote had you for dinner, yes. Nudge, nudge, get it. I mean, those were commonplace jokes. And so I think for some people, the feeling is that we are now applying, modern standards, to judge that sort of thing. But for black people, this stuff was always offensive. It was always dehumanizing. It was always racist. It was always horrible. I think you're going to be hard pressed to find a president if you start going back like that, where you won't find rhetoric like that. And with Reagan, there was policy matched to the rhetoric. It wasn't just that he called black people monkeys. It was that there was a politics of treating black people as though they were subhuman. And that really has not changed if you look at the party today, the Republican Party today.
I wanted to ask you, you and I have not talked offline about the debates, I think, and I don't know how much of them you got to watch, but I'm curious what you think about the sort of conversation, the meta conversations emerged a bit about the sort of fear that Democrats are backing themselves into corners on unpopular issues. There were several questions about reparations and sort of a surprising, I think, amount of support for either the beginnings of some sort of study or actual reparations, and then people point to the fact that doesn't poll very well. And I wonder what you think about the analysis that says the Democrats are playing with fire by backing themselves into corners, supporting things that might be unpopular.
I mean, I'm struggling to detect the difference between this primary debate and other primary debates on both sides in general. Primary debates are generally different than what happens in the general election. And what generally happens, with some recent exceptions, is people tack away from positions that they made before. I believe that Barack Obama, when he was debating with Hillary Clinton, didn't he make the promise that there would be no mandate?
Yes.
And then immediately, as soon as he won, immediately dispensed that. So I'm having a hard time seeing why this is different. There's certainly more candidates, so there may be more people doing that. But I don't get what fundamentally is happening here that's different than, in other times.
All right. Ta-Nehisi Coates, thank you so much for making some time from Cooperstown, New York today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I love you, Baltimore.
All right. Thanks a lot, man. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.